Breakups are never easy, even when you know deep down they're for the best. After parting ways with my partner of nearly 3 years, I'd been doing my best to hold myself together. It wasn't some dramatic fallout or a shouting match, it was just the slow realization that we'd grown apart. That didn't make the healing process any less painful. Everywhere I turned, there seemed to be reminders of him. To move on, I stuck firmly to the no-contact rule, convincing myself it was the healthiest option for both of us, even though it felt like a constant uphill battle. One of the hardest parts was losing the little rituals we shared, especially playing pool together. That had been our thing. I've always been a decent player, above average, I'd say, but he was exceptional. On a good day, he could effortlessly sink trick shots that left people watching in awe. Bank shots, double rails, kick combos, he even started practicing those crazy mass shots that defy gravity. We both had pool tables at home, but staying cooped up indoors wasn't our style. Instead, we'd scout out low-key bars with decent tables to play on. We hated the loud, overcrowded spots where you had to wait forever to get a turn and shout just to be heard. Dive bars with their worn-out tables and sticky floors were our sweet spot. Sure, the tables weren't pristine, but they beat the chaos of college bars any day. We were usually the youngest people there, surrounded by an older crowd nursing beers and reminiscing over jukebox tunes. But we didn't mind. By that point in our relationship, we'd moved past the get drunk every weekend college phase and preferred quieter, more meaningful nights. My ex's charm made it easy to strike up conversations with anyone, and our shared skill at pool meant we rarely had to wait long for a game. A few weeks ago, nostalgia hit me harder than usual. It was a dull Tuesday evening, and most of my friends were busy with work or school. I couldn't bear the thought of sitting alone in my apartment, wallowing in the memories of what we used to have, so I made a spontaneous decision to revisit one of the dive bars we used to frequent. I told myself it wasn't about reliving the past, I just needed to get out and breathe. Normally, I'd never go out alone like that, it's just not in my nature. But something about that night made me brave enough to try. When I stepped inside, it was like no time had passed. The dim lighting, creaky bar stools, and jukebox playing softly in the corner, it was all exactly how I remembered. It was almost too much. The flood of memories was overwhelming, and for a split second, I considered turning right back around. But I forced myself to stay. I grabbed a drink, let the burn of whiskey settle my nerves, and wandered over to one of the pool tables. I picked up a cue and started chalking it absent-mindedly, unsure of what I was even doing there. Playing solo felt awkward, but I didn't have to worry for long. A guy, probably in his late 20s, approached the table. He was the only person in the room close to my age, so it wasn't too surprising when he leaned against the table and asked if I wanted to play a game. I shrugged and said, "Sure, rack them up." He fumbled a bit while setting up the balls, making me chuckle quietly to myself. I didn't correct him, though, it felt unnecessary. We started playing, and I realized he wasn't bad. He wasn't on my ex's level, but he held his own. I wasn't in the mood to let him win, though, so I played seriously and won every game we played. As we played, he struck up some small talk. He even bought me a couple of drinks, which I appreciated. He seemed nice enough, but it didn't take long to notice he wasn't the sharpest conversationalist. I've always been drawn to quick-witted, intelligent people who can challenge me in a discussion. This guy wasn't that. Still, he was friendly, and I was grateful for the distraction. For the first time in weeks, I felt myself loosening up, laughing, and not overthinking every little thing. After our fourth game, though, the mood shifted. Out of the blue, he asked if I wanted to go back to his place. The question caught me completely off guard. I froze for a moment before giving a nervous laugh and shaking my head. I tried to keep it light, joking that he'd need to earn a second date first. The truth was, I wasn't looking for anything serious, or anything at all, for that matter. The breakup was still too fresh, and I wasn't ready to jump into something new, especially not with someone I'd just met on a random Tuesday. My attempt to brush him off didn't land the way I'd hoped. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. The friendly smile he'd worn all night disappeared, replaced by a sharp, almost menacing scowl. I couldn't believe the sudden shift. "Are you serious?" he snapped, his voice low but laced with anger. Before I could react, he grabbed my wrist, his grip uncomfortably tight. My stomach twisted with fear, and I froze, unsure of what to do. Then, without warning, he snatched my purse off the table. The shock hit me like a freight train. I'd never been in a situation like this before, and instead of screaming or yanking it back, I just stood there, paralyzed by fear. Even though the bar wasn't crowded, it was still a public place, and I thought someone had to step in. Thankfully, I was right. A pair of older guys sitting nearby noticed what was happening and immediately intervened. One of them stood up and barked, "Let her go," his voice firm and authoritative. The guy hesitated, glancing between the men and me. He mumbled something under his breath, something I couldn't quite catch, before tossing my purse back onto the table. His glare lingered on me for a moment longer, and then he stormed out of the bar, shoving the door open so hard it nearly hit the wall. My heart was still racing as I clutched my purse to my chest, whispering frantic thank yous to the men who'd stepped in. That was it for me. I called for an Uber and left the bar, still shaken and trying to process what had just happened. But the night wasn't over. As I sat in the back of the car, I decided to check my phone for the first time since leaving the bar. That's when I saw it, a notification that said, "AirTag found moving with you." My blood ran cold. Someone had slipped a tracker into my bag. My mind raced with panic as I rifled through my purse, eventually finding the tiny device tucked between my belongings. I yanked it out and smashed it on the ground the moment I got home. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I stood in my living room, trying to calm my nerves, I noticed headlights outside my window. A car was creeping down my street, moving slowly and deliberately. It passed once, then again. My heart sank as I recognized the driver. It was him. He'd followed me home. As I stood there, trembling and staring at the broken AirTag in the middle of the street, the weight of what had just happened began to crush me. My breath was shaky, my chest tight, and I felt like the world had just closed in around me. I glanced nervously down the empty road, knowing that whoever had planted that tracker could still be close. Without another second's hesitation, I grabbed my bag and sprinted to the back of the house. My fingers fumbled frantically with the lock, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. When the door finally clicked open, I stumbled inside, slammed it shut behind me, and locked every bolt I could find. The cold night air still clung to me, but I didn't feel safe enough to stop and breathe. I rushed to my bedroom, locking that door too, as if it would make a difference. My legs felt like jelly as I collapsed onto the edge of the bed, clutching my phone with trembling hands. Normally, I'd be sound asleep by now, drifting off to the white noise of my favorite playlist. But tonight, there was no way I could close my eyes, not when I felt like the world outside was watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. Hoping to calm myself, I wandered over to the window and pulled back the curtain, hoping the familiar view of the quiet street would offer some comfort. But what I saw only made my stomach sink. At first, it seemed innocent enough, an old, beat-up Lincoln rolling slowly down the road. The car passed by without stopping, its headlights casting faint shadows against the houses. But something about the way it moved made my skin crawl. It wasn't just slow, it was deliberate, as if the driver was searching for something. Or someone. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just shaken from everything that had happened earlier. But when the car came back, this time from the opposite direction, I couldn't deny it any longer. My instincts screamed that something was very, very wrong. The car crept along even slower this time, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribcage as I ducked below the window, trying to stay out of sight. Peeking out cautiously, I noticed the driver's side window was rolled down halfway, and I froze. The driver wasn't just passing through, they were looking. For me. The reality hit me like a ton of bricks. It had to be him, the man from the bar. My pulse quickened as I crouched there, gripping the edge of the windowsill so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to call the police, but my brain felt like it was in a fog. What if calling for help confirmed I was here? What if he already knew? The next time the car passed, the driver's hand dangled out of the window, gripping something that glinted faintly in the streetlight. My stomach twisted as I realized what it was, a knife. This wasn't just some creep trying to scare me. He meant business. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, the car stopped directly across from my house, the engine idling. My breath caught in my throat as I ducked even lower, pressing myself against the floor. I felt completely helpless, my mind racing with 100 worst-case scenarios. My only hope was that he'd eventually give up. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, too terrified to move. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I dared to peek through the curtain again. The car was gone. Relief and terror collided inside me, leaving me shaking uncontrollably. I didn't move for another hour, my eyes glued to the street, half expecting the headlights to return at any moment. But they never did. The next morning, I told my parents everything. As I recounted the events of the night, my dad's expression shifted from concern to anger, not at me, but at the situation. He scolded me for not calling the police immediately, but I explained that I'd been too scared to think straight. Without wasting any time, he picked up the phone and called an old friend of his, a police chief, to ask for advice. After hearing the story, the chief told us there wasn't much they could do without a plate number or more concrete evidence. It was infuriating but also not surprising. He urged us to stay vigilant and to call the police immediately if the car or its driver showed up again. For days, I refused to leave the house. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see that Lincoln parked down the street, its shadowy driver watching, waiting for me to step outside. Even now, the thought of him sends chills down my spine. I've tried to convince myself that it's over, that he's moved on and I'm safe. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere, biding his time. And that's the scariest part, not knowing if the nightmare is truly over or if it's just beginning. I've tried to convince myself that the nightmare is over, but sometimes I still catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting that car to show up again. Maybe it's just paranoia, but the fear lingers, a subtle reminder of how quickly life can take a sinister turn. For the most part, though, my life has fallen back into its comfortable rhythm. I'm 40, single, and childless, not exactly everyone's idea of fulfillment, but I'm okay with it. My days are predictable, my job is steady, and my house, while modest and located in a middle-of-the-road neighborhood, is all mine. I work as a bartender at an upscale rooftop bar in a neighboring town, catering to a clientele that considers regular bars beneath them. The job isn't glamorous, but it has its perks. The tips are generous, and the rotating crowd keeps things interesting. The bar's high-end atmosphere means I don't deal with the same regulars you'd find in a dive, and I like that. While I enjoy meeting new people, I've always preferred to keep a certain level of distance. It's just how I am. I'm not the type to get too close to customers or let them get too familiar with me. Maybe that's why the events of one particular Friday night threw me off so completely. The bar was buzzing, packed with groups of friends raising their glasses, couples sharing quiet conversations, and a handful of people who seemed to wander in just to feel important. I was in my element, mixing drinks and observing the crowd as I always do. One of my favorite mental games is trying to figure out who's genuine and who's putting on a show. The guy ordering a complicated cocktail is probably trying to impress someone, while the one asking for whiskey neat has likely had a rough day. I was in the middle of taking stock of the crowd when I noticed a couple at the far end of the bar. They were down to their last sips of wine, and I made a mental note to offer them a refill before they flagged me down. That's when I saw him. Someone walked through the entrance, and I knew immediately that he didn't belong. He was younger than most of the bar's usual patrons, probably mid-30s, and his appearance was unsettling. His jet black hair was unkempt, sticking out in messy tufts like he hadn't bothered with it in days. He wore a plain black hoodie under a faded leather jacket, both covered in stains that suggested they hadn't been cleaned in ages. But it wasn't his clothes that caught my attention, it was his face. He was scowling, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. There was an intensity in his eyes, a kind of simmering anger that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder how he'd gotten past the doorman downstairs, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. He made a beeline for the bar, not bothering to sit down. Instead, he stood there, staring directly at me with an unnerving intensity. His glare felt almost personal, though I couldn't for the life of me figure out why. Trying to stay professional, I cleared my throat and asked if I could get him something to drink. My voice was calm, but inside, my nerves were on edge. He didn't respond right away, just kept staring at me like he was sizing me up. Finally, he muttered, "A double shot of Jaeger." His voice was low and gruff, almost a growl. I nodded, grabbed a glass, and poured the shot. Jaeger isn't exactly the drink of choice for this place. It's a far cry from the fancy cocktails and top-shelf liquors most patrons order, but I wasn't about to question his taste. I set the glass in front of him and moved on to serve other customers, trying to shake off the unease his presence had stirred in me. When I returned to collect his payment, he tossed a crumpled wad of cash onto the counter. That caught me off guard. Cash transactions were rare here, where everyone usually paid with sleek cards or even phone apps. But again, I told myself it wasn't my place to judge and rang him up. I was about to move on when he spoke again, and his words stopped me cold. "I knew I'd find you here, Kevin," he said. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as his words sank in. How did he know my name? My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. I set the glass I was holding down carefully, my hands trembling slightly, and looked him in the eyes. "How do you know my name?" I demanded, my voice low but firm. I didn't want to cause a scene, but I needed answers. He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me with the same angry intensity, like he was daring me to figure it out. Finally, he said, "I know what you did." My stomach dropped. What was he talking about? What could I have possibly done to warrant this kind of cryptic accusation? Before I could press him further, he turned and walked away, heading toward the elevators without another word. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing. I didn't recognize him. I didn't know his name, his face, or anything about him. And yet, he seemed to know me, and not in a good way. The rest of my shift was a blur. I couldn't focus, couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just encountered something, or someone, that was going to turn my life upside down. By the time I clocked out and headed home, I was still trying to piece everything together. Who was he? What did he mean? I racked my brain, replaying every interaction I'd had over the past few years, but nothing made sense. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The man's words echoed in my mind, haunting me with their ambiguity. I didn't know what I'd done, but whatever it was, he seemed determined to hold me accountable. And as much as I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that he was just some deranged stranger, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The unease that had settled over me earlier in the night never really went away, and sometime in the dead of night, it jolted me awake. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. I didn't need to use the bathroom, and the house was as silent as ever. But something felt off. Without moving a muscle, I opened my eyes just enough to let them adjust to the darkness. It was then that I saw it, an ominous shadowy figure standing in the corner of my bedroom near the door. My heart felt like it skipped a beat before launching into a frantic rhythm. I knew instantly that whatever or whoever it was didn't belong there. Forcing myself to remain perfectly still, I kept my breathing steady, feigning sleep as I tried to process the reality of the situation. Someone was in my room. The thought repeated over and over in my head until it became deafening. I knew I couldn't just lie there. Counting silently to 3, I gathered every ounce of courage I had and launched myself out of bed, screaming at the top of my lungs in an attempt to scare or disorient the intruder. To my surprise, the figure didn't confront me. Instead, it bolted toward the door. I barely registered the sound of something metallic clattering to the floor as I chased after the intruder, adrenaline overriding every ounce of fear. I made it as far as the front door, which was wide open, but the person was already gone, swallowed by the night. I hesitated, torn between running out into the yard to see where they'd gone and staying inside, where it was at least somewhat safe. Logic prevailed. Slamming the door shut, I locked it with shaking hands and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I remembered the noise I'd heard earlier, the sound of something falling. Heart pounding, I forced myself to walk back into my bedroom and switched on the light. The sight waiting for me made my stomach churn. There, lying on the floor in the corner of my room, was one of my kitchen knives. The implications were horrifying. Whoever had been in my house hadn't just broken in, they'd come prepared to harm me, maybe even kill me. The realization left me nauseated. I grabbed my phone and called the police immediately, explaining the situation as best I could through my shaky voice. They arrived quickly, combing through both my house and the yard for any trace of the intruder. But no windows were broken, no locks tampered with, and there were no signs of forced entry anywhere. It made no sense. I'd locked every door and window before going to bed, as I always did. I gave them a description of the man from the bar, hoping it would help. They assured me they'd pull the bar security footage and follow up, but I could tell they weren't optimistic. They couldn't find any evidence of how he'd entered my home, and without that, they had little to go on. Days passed, and the police never found him or any explanation for what had happened. As time went on, the fear didn't fully subside. I double-checked the locks every night, kept a light on in the hallway, and jumped at the smallest noises. The thought that he'd been in my home, standing over me as I slept, haunted me. The worst part? I couldn't stop questioning how he got inside. Did I make a mistake locking up? Was there a vulnerability in my house I hadn't noticed? Or was it something more sinister, something I couldn't explain? I haven't seen him since, but the memory of that night lingers like a shadow, creeping in whenever I let my guard down. It's a constant reminder that sometimes the real nightmare begins when you think you've woken up. I didn't have much time to dwell on the oddity of the elderly couple when they first arrived. The bar was in full swing, and my hands were busy pouring drinks and ringing up tabs. It wasn't until about an hour later, while lining up a row of gin and tonics, that my eyes drifted back to their corner. Something about them felt off, and it finally clicked. They hadn't moved at all. No food, no drinks, no conversation. They just sat there, stiff as statues, staring blankly at the wall beside them. Their stillness seemed almost unnatural, a jarring contrast to the lively energy buzzing through the rest of the room. I couldn't shake my curiosity. Maybe they were waiting for someone? Or perhaps they didn't realize they had to come to the bar to place an order? With that in mind, I resolved to approach them as soon as I had a moment to spare. When the rush finally thinned out, I grabbed a bar towel and walked over, putting on my best polite smile. As I neared their table, I noticed neither of them turned to acknowledge me. They remained locked in their silent vigil, eyes fixed on the wall. Clearing my throat, I asked if they needed anything to eat or drink. The woman didn't react, not even a flinch. Her gaze remained steady and vacant, almost as if I didn't exist. The man, however, moved. Slowly, almost painfully, he turned his head toward me. His pale, wrinkled skin caught the dim light, and his deeply sunken eyes seemed to bore straight into mine. A shiver ran down my spine as he simply shook his head, one deliberate, silent motion. He didn't say a word, and his expression revealed nothing. I muttered a quick acknowledgement and retreated to the bar, unnerved. Something about them wasn't right. They didn't belong here, or maybe even in this decade. I avoided looking in their direction for the rest of my shift, too unsettled to deal with whatever strange energy they brought into the room. Eventually, as the crowd began to thin out, I glanced back toward their booth. My heart jumped into my throat when I saw them staring directly at me this time, both of them. Their unblinking eyes seemed to cut through the air between us, locking me in place. I made direct eye contact with the woman, her cold, expressionless face sending a chill through me. For a second, I couldn't move. I had to force myself to look away, pretending to busy myself with wiping down the counter. When I mustered the courage to glance back, the booth was empty. Relief washed over me, though it came with a side of guilt. It felt cruel to be glad they were gone, but their presence had left me rattled in a way I couldn't explain. As I wiped down the bar and prepared to close up for the night, the encounter kept playing on a loop in my mind. I decided to ask Karen, my coworker and the closest thing we had to a human security camera, if she'd noticed anything strange. Karen was a veteran at the bar, the kind of person who could recite the night's drink orders and remember every face that came through the door. When I asked her about the couple, she looked genuinely puzzled. Shaking her head, she told me she hadn't seen anyone like that. At first, I thought she was joking, but the sincerity in her voice was clear. She even listed off at least 10 other patrons from the night, describing what they wore and what they ordered, just to prove her point. I laughed it off, joking that I must have been hallucinating, but inside, I was reeling. How could she have missed them? They'd been sitting there for at least an hour, their presence impossible to ignore, or so I thought. As we locked up and headed out, doubt began to creep in. Was it possible I'd imagined the whole thing? The thought made me uneasy. By the time I reached my car, the night's events were weighing heavily on me. Fumbling with my keys, I froze when I looked up. Across the street, under the glow of a dim streetlight, stood two shadowy figures. My stomach dropped as I recognized them. It was the couple. They were just standing there, side by side, watching me. Panic surged through me, freezing me in place for a split second before instinct took over. I dove into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't look back as I peeled out of the parking lot, too afraid of what I might see if I did. The drive home was a blur. My thoughts raced, each more unsettling than the last. Were they following me? How had they gotten there so quickly? Were they even real? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was on the verge of a breakdown. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't stop replaying the image of them standing under that streetlight. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. I never saw the couple again, but the memory of their faces, their eerie stillness, and the way they seemed to target me has stayed with me ever since. Some nights, I find myself looking out my window, half expecting to see them standing in the shadows. Whatever they were, whoever they were, they left me with more questions than answers, and I'm not sure I'll ever find peace.